Hello, everyone, and welcome to all of you still coming through the door. We are absolutely delighted to have you join us here for the second in our Higher Education Digital Transformation webinar series. It's great to see you here. If you haven't been to one before, one of the first things to do is say hi in the chat. We love to know where you're coming in from, and normally we can cover about 20 countries within the first 60 seconds. So would love to see you appearing there. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our speakers for today. If you haven't used this platform before, you'll find the chat over to the right with the usual icon. During the session, you'll also find some polls there. There's a little tab called polls, and to take part in those, you'll need to just click on that and go and see them. There's a questions tab as well, if you like to use that. Lots of options for interaction. And just a little tip for you, if you're hearing a little sound as people are writing in the chat, which you will do because I can see it's filling up now, if you just mute the little bell in the chat, that will stop that from happening for you. I'll also reiterate that these sessions are recorded and you'll get a version straight into your inbox directly after this that you'll be able to share with other people if you think they'll be interested too. So this will be a very lively session, slightly different from some of our previous sessions, which I'm excited about. It'll be a slightly different format. So let me go ahead and do some introductions. First, we have Dr. Rajika Bhandari joining us. Rajika is an international higher education expert with over 25 years of experience across the non-profit, private and higher education sectors. She's the founder of Rajika Bhandari Advisors, which focuses on student mobility research and data-driven insights. So she's looking at monitoring, evaluation, impact studies of international education programs and shaping thought leadership strategy. So you can see already why she's with us today. She's previously held senior roles at the Institute of International Education for over a decade, and she led there the research, evaluation, thought leadership portfolio, including the Open Doors Project. And even more interestingly, she's published a book called America Calling, a Foreign Student in a Country of Possibility. So we have an absolute stellar expert on our hands, and her head is absolutely in this space because she's just come from the AIEA conference over in the US. So wonderful to have you here, Rajika. We look forward to having you in conversation with Patrick within a matter of minutes. And Patrick is our co-CEO and will be running most of this session together with Rajika.
Hey, everybody.
Thank you. All right, if you're new to this and new to Holon IQ, a very, very brief introduction. Holon IQ is an impact intelligence platform. We're working across the education, health and climate sectors. So we're an enterprise software as a service. And we have an absolutely gorgeous global team spread across New York, London and Sydney. Our customers, as a quick browse of those logos there, are hundreds of global leaders in impact, academia, finance and technology. And we love working with them, particularly in areas like this that are so interesting at the moment. Just to situate where we are in this series, this is webinar 2, international education. A couple of weeks ago, we kicked off the whole digital transformation theme, looking at where we are now. And then over the next few weeks, we'll be working through OPMs, a deep dive into Latin America, which is going to be absolutely fascinating, and then rounding out with new credentials by the end of March. So please do join us for those. Okay, our agenda for today, we're going to dip very briefly into the higher education digital capability framework, just to situate international education within that space. And then Rajika and Patrick are going to work through some aspects of international education at the moment, global flows and demand, expenditure and outlook, and then some next steps. Okay, for those of you who've been following along for probably a little over a year and a half now, you'll know that this is our higher education digital capability framework. And this has been a real anchor for us as we've been working through some of these big themes in higher education around the world. It has 4 dimensions, working through the learner life cycle, going from demand and discovery through learning design, learner experience, and work and lifelong learning. And it's been a really useful way to look at themes like this from a digital capability perspective. So for example, for international education, if you just kind of squint at this and imagine the colored boxes are the ones that are particularly relevant for international education. Now, we've argued over this, and you could strongly argue that digital capabilities deep down and across the whole learner life cycle are relevant to international education. But you might see, if you zoom out, particularly in the early part of the life cycle, where you're looking at product strategy, where you're looking through marketing processes and student recruitment, down in that vertical of teaching strategies, international education has some particularly interesting digital capability developments going on. And then you'll see the green lit up quite strong. So learner and academic experience, student life, all those things through to social and well-being assessment and verification. And then, of course, into work and lifelong learning. And I think as lifelong learning really is taking hold and alumni are far and wide across the globe, it's such an interesting space as well for international education. So I'm not going to linger on that. We're going to bring you straight in with our first poll, which you'll see launching very soon. And we're just interested in, as you reflect on your own work and your own institutions, which of those digital capabilities, as far as you're concerned, are most crucial for supporting international education at your institution? Is it demand and discovery? Is it learning design? Is it learner experience, or work and lifelong learning? And if you haven't found a poll, down to the right should have a little red one next to it. Go ahead and click. Okay. I'll give you another second for the votes to come through. Okay, so learner experience is coming up high, not far behind demand and discovery. I think I probably primed you to choose some of those, but it's absolutely a conversation we're hearing around those capabilities and how we can support students in their learning and their lives once they're in institutions and once they're so far from home and so on. Patrick and Rajika will go much more deeply around some super interesting data around this. So that's it from me for now. I will pass across and keep an eye on the chat.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Wonderful work. And I'm still fascinated that 50% of people have chosen learner experience, 30% demand and discovery. That is really interesting. That I thought that might happen, but that's still a surprise. All right, welcome everybody. We're going to jump right into the content now. As Lucy mentioned, we are so lucky that Rajika is joining us today to provide some flavor and some insights from her kind of deep expertise. I'm going to start by reminding us all, I mean, there's a really broad range of folks who have joined us today. I can see some international education experts and I can see some people who are just very intrigued at this market and would like to learn more and don't have as much background. So we're going to do our best to kind of sit somewhere in the middle. But as the experts know, this is a tough place when it comes to data. There are some wonderful sources out there. We've drawn on all of them as part of our work. We started our own internal project we called Global Flows in 2018, which everyone who's been part of this industry starts with wrestling spreadsheets and government databases and trying to get them to reconcile, but basically doing a little bit more work to look for forward indicators and the like. The crazy graphic you can see on the right-hand side there is something those who've been with us for many years will be familiar with. It's actually a graphic available at globalflows.holoniq.com and just allows you to interactively see the flow of students around the world. We haven't updated that since that we first started that project, but it's a fun way to get to know what the dominant flows around the world are. I'm going to start I'd love to hear, and I promise I haven't asked Rajika this ahead of time, how you've managed to wrestle with all of this data in all of your years of trying to make sense of international education data.
Yeah, thanks for that, Patrick. And let me just thank Lucy for getting us started, and really delighted to be joining you all in this conversation. And yes, the aligning the data and the different sources of data is not easy. I think it continues to be a challenge. and almost everything that you've listed here are sort of the go-to resources that many of us would look to. And I think some of the main challenges are around definitional issues of how different data sets or measurements are really capturing the whole student mobility phenomenon and looking at concepts a little bit differently. So I think there's alignment around or lack of alignment around definitions. There's a lack of alignment around time periods, even what sort of constitutes length of a degree or a period of study for certain degrees. So I think there are all of those issues. But I think the good news is that there is greater awareness about the sources of data, where I think a large part of it has been about educating consumers of the data to also begin looking at these data sources directly themselves. And the other piece I would add is that you mentioned the national level data that many countries have, and some of it very high quality. I think there's also additional level below that, when some countries, there's some excellent data available that sheds additional light on international education for that country's higher education sector. So in the US, for example, the two other sources I would mention very quickly are, for example, of course, you've got Project Atlas here. There's Open Doors for, again, the national level snapshot for mobility data. But the two that I really want to talk about or mention quickly are, for example, the data that comes out of the Council of Graduate Schools, or CGS, which provides a deep dive into looking at international student flows at the graduate level in the US. And that's really interesting. And then the other one I wanted to mention quickly is the American Councils on Education, ACE, which does their institutional level internationalization survey. And in fact, at the international global level, there's a similar survey by the International Association of Universities. So all of that to say that I think we have kind of the big sources that give us a global snapshot, and then there are these other efforts which allow us to begin disentangling some of the detailed picture around international education.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Rajika. And so we thought on the topic of data that we would start, before I jump in, just in terms of methodology of how we've gone about this. So, with respect to all of the challenges that Rajika just spoke about, we at HolonIQ have essentially built dedicated tools to challenging these data aspects. And so what you can see in front is our own platform. It's not the international education data, but allowing us to essentially attack something so high dimensional as international education, where there are many source markets, where there are many destination markets, where there is postgrad, there is undergrad, there are different price points, there are different growth rates for all of those. And so suffice to say, we've gone to a lot of effort to try and tackle the challenges that Rajika's talked about. It is incredibly challenging because, as Rajika mentioned, some destination markets will have just, awesome detail, but it is very difficult to map that detail to either source markets or to compare with other markets who might have fundamentally different definitions as well about those markets. So jumping right in, let me very quickly explain what we're looking at. And then again, Rajika, I'd really love to hear your take. But this chart is spanning from 1970 on the left out to 2030 on the right. The blue line is tracing the total number of global student flows, that's physical flows of students traveling to study overseas. You can see back in 1970, it was just under 1 million students, and it grew really steadily with some bumps and some surges through there all the way up to COVID. And we expect it to keep growing is kind of the top line. Some of the numbers and labeling you can see there, the kind of square boxy growth rates. So on the left, 57%, then 100%, then 109%. That's the total growth over 15-year spans in the student flows. So over the prior to 15-year spans, we saw more than 100% growth in student flows. The numbers above that with the CAGRs are annualized compound average growth rates. So that 5% means from 1990 through to the pandemic, we saw on average about 5% growth in volume of students, numbers of students. We've labeled what we all experienced in international education are some of the major disruptions around the world that all gave rise to question marks about the resilience of international education. And one of our reflections in preparing this was just how resilient international education actually is when you look over such a long time span. On the right-hand side, you can see the three major scenarios that were part of this work. It was a downside scenario, which saw a halt of growth, some depression over a prolonged period out to 2030. It didn't contemplate a free fall at all. That wasn't the feedback we had from interviews. The base case really contemplated a growth rate that, suffered in the short term but recovered over and out to 2030. It kind of represented just under the long-term growth rate of 5% compounding average growth because of that depression through the pandemic and coming out. And then an upside scenario that represented some of the discourse that we're hearing, which is a pent-up demand surge that is prolonged through to the end of this decade. Those three scenarios would see on the downside us sit where we are about today, somewhere between 5 and 6 million students, depending on which data sources you're reconciling. The base case would get us to about 8 million students, and the upside 9 million as a floor and proceeding from there. So before I kind of dig in any further, I just wanted to pause there, Rajika, and you've worked with this data for so long, is when you see it over such a long time span like this and some of how we've thought moving forward, what's running through your mind?
So I guess the main thing running through my mind is that I think, of course, the projections and the attempt to project and look ahead is really important. But my inclination is really to get below sort of those big trends that we are seeing, and what's the nuance then, what's the context and what's the nuance. So as I look at this, I mean, I think there are three observations that I want to make. One is that very often when we are trying to look at this very big global picture, there is really a tendency to just focus on sort of those major global developments or developments in a particular context, whether it's the US context or the North American context or even the global North context. But we often tend to oversee developments that are actually happening in students' home countries and home regions, which are really, there's the push and pull factors, right? Which can often be the push factors or the constraining factors from their perspective. So some examples that come to mind, and again, thinking about sort of what are some of the subpopulations, what are some of those nuances. For example, when the Indian economy and the Indian currency was severely devalued some years ago, it had a massive hit on countries like the US and others, and actually many countries, since Indian students are the second largest group of globally mobile students. Now, again, that affected, one could argue that that's just about Indian students, but in fact, it has a ripple effect across all of these big numbers that we look at and projections that we look at. So sort of that's one point, that, what's really happening in students' own contexts and regions that we must keep in mind. The other is really looking at major global events and shifts. And we're talking about international education today, which sits within the broader area of international relations and affairs. And I have to acknowledge, I mean, I can't do this session today and not acknowledge what's happening between Ukraine and Russia. And I mention this because it's those sorts of global developments that eventually begin to also affect higher education systems in students' countries, in their regions, that cause them to, again, either not be able to go abroad if they had envisioned doing so, or in fact pushing students overseas, sometimes for not the right reasons. And indeed, in recent years, we've seen a rise in refugee students and refugee student flows across borders. And how exactly are we accounting for that within the framework of international education? So again, thinking about, some of the global forces and developments we've seen recently, the growth of nationalism across many countries, regressive immigration policies, Brexit. Here in the US, where I sit, we've seen our own share of challenges. So again, thinking about how all of those are going to affect this overall picture. And I know it's hard to measure. It's very hard to measure the impact of those, but they're important considerations nonetheless. And then the third sort of nuance that I want to surface quickly is that we do tend to, again, for the sake of projections, think of international students as being a uniform group, but there are, in fact, significant differences by academic level. And depending on what's going on in certain countries and which group of students are affected more or less, can actually have significant implications for receiving countries, because we know that a lot of the revenue from international students, at least for countries like the US, comes from undergraduate students, not from graduate students so much. So again, looking at those sorts of nuances, I think, is really important.
Wonderful insight. I think, you certainly made me reflect about the conversation around international education becoming so much more conscious for most countries around the world through the pandemic as well. I think as many started to feel the big geopolitical influences on global flows, the, as you say, kind of currency affordability, kind of accessibility impacts, and the national significance of international education to supporting, university funding, and all sorts that are a little bit hidden for those who are not international experts in the day-to-day outside of a pandemic, where some of these things really came to the fore. Let's move on to demand, and I think we're going to establish a bit of this trend. We've pitched very, very big picture to help you zoom out, and I think what Rajika, you've been incredibly helpful already, is really drilling into specifics underneath that big picture. So let me kind of paint that big picture again. On the left-hand side, you can see here the global population of those whose highest level of educational attainment is post-secondary education. So there's a wonderful data set by the Wittgenstein Center, which looks at population forecasts and splits those by educational attainment. And what we've done here is looked at the total global population who have attained historically a post-secondary credential and who are expected to or forecast to in a medium, not an aggressive forecast scenario. And this would suggest, really big picture, that we're expecting another billion over the next 30 years, to billion people to attain a degree or a post-secondary credential. Of course, inside that is the whole micro-credentials and alternative credentials kind of conversation. But what's, just breathtaking here is just how big Asia really is, one of the dominant sources, of course, of international students. Africa surprises a lot of people when they see this chart, and it just keeps getting bigger. Europe, again, surprises a lot of people, especially those from outside Europe, about the global flows there and about population. It would be remiss, of course, to note that we're not so sure about the birth rate assumptions of population forecasts these days. Post-pandemic, there's been some significant changes through the pandemic, and I think it's anyone's guess on so many topics how the next few years will unfold, and whether some of those things will return to long-term averages or change kind of permanently. And on the right-hand side, we're kind of really breaking that down so you can see those numbers. So Asia, 173 million students are expected to graduate between 2020 and 2030. A total of 592 million over the course of 2020 through to 2050. Africa, enormous. You can see that stack there, and around the world. I think the kind of big picture for us here was kind of reminding ourselves just how enormous the demand is for post-secondary credentials, aside from international education, but just when we look kind of big picture. Again, Rajika, I'd love to kind of hear what kind of strikes you when you reflect on an outlook like this.
Yeah, I think my main reaction is to a point that you began to talk about, which is around demographics and either demographic growth or constriction and rates. And in sort of, again, looking at the nuance around Asia, that we tend to, again, talk of it as a cohesive region, but in fact, there are quite a few variations within it. And if I'm not mistaken, according to projections, really most of the future growth is slated to come from South Asia and India in particular, whereas China and then Japan, of course, we know has had a declining population, has had declining population growth for a while, but that China and some other countries are actually going to see some constriction in their population. So again, I think that's that additional level of detail on, yes, looking at it regionally, but then within the region, you know, what are some intra-regional variations?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great point as well. From macro down to micro is Asia is absolutely not one cohesive region or group of countries, and there are some standouts there, Indonesia, and there's just some fascinating economies that are growing. Switching to the supply side, the question is kind of who is going to train and educate all of these students, these billion students around the world. And again, that is not just international students, obviously, that's all of us around the world. And on the left-hand side, we've kind of reminded ourselves how many students we're talking about. So that stack of 592 million people in Asia who are expected to gain a post-secondary credential over the next 30 years. The next two charts really take we've picked, and we'll probably get in a lot of trouble for picking one of the rankings providers, Times Higher Ed data, and we've stacked there in the middle chart the number of the top 1,000 universities stacked by where they are in the world and colored by their ranking. So if you just tune your eyes into blue, you can see the number of universities from the top 200 and where they're distributed around the world. If you tune into green, you'll get the next layer, 200 to 500, and if you tune into yellow, you'll get that stack from 500 to 1,000. And of course, all the caveats of rankings data should be overlaid here as we're thinking this through. The rightmost chart looks at the enrollment capacity of those top 1,000 universities as well. And so we're not just looking at the number of institutions, we're looking at enrollment capacity. And so here, I think one of our key takeaways is that a portion of those students, let's take Asia or Africa as an example, are going to want to study internationally. They're going to want to study in another economy to pick up those skills, to pick up those education. Many will want to study at a top university for the experience that it's going to give them. And so many of those institutions are in Europe and North America. There's a handful in Oceania as well. And we see Asia growing its own, very prestigious, top, well-regarded institutions as well. And so this is where we see kind of the supply side meeting the demand side for international education. But let me pause again, Rajika, and how do you think through and kind of interpret this supply meets demand dynamic?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on sort of the last point that you were closing with, that again, when we look at overall demand, it needs to really account again for what's happening in the higher education sectors of students' home countries. And again, if we look at just those two top kind of supply countries, and I put this in quotes, source countries, again, India and China, those are higher education sectors that have been growing rapidly over the past several years with both countries making a huge effort to build out and expand their own higher education sectors. And India just released its a new national education policy in 2020. That was the first new policy in 34 years, and internationalization is a strong component of that policy. I think taken together with the fact that COVID has been a time where students have had to take stock and sort of take a fresh look at their options. I think many students in those countries were suddenly beginning to take a closer look at some of the top institutions at home and feeling like they could probably offer them a viable, high quality education that would come close to one that was at an institution overseas. So I think all of those dynamics are going to be at play as we think about what's at offer different institutions. And then the third piece, just really quickly, that I think this is probably not accounting for, because again, it's really hard to get the data, is how the sudden growth in online provision by some of these top institutions is going to play into this picture. Because I think through the pandemic, there hasn't been any institution that's not considered or hasn't quickly pivoted to begin offering all sorts of sandwich programs and programs beginning in the student's home country and then partially in the destination country, etc. So all of that's going to, I think, reshape the idea of enrollment capacity. That what do we really mean by that? Because that's really premised on the idea of people in seats and being physically present in classrooms, which we know is already changing.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think it's worth calling out, and for those who aren't aware, there's a whole analyst note on the HolonIQ website that works through some of this analysis as well. But when we conducted our interviews and did our own analysis, it looked as though digital, in the main, was actually a tailwind to more physical travel by international students, which is quite, I think, counterintuitive to some, that it would add to the number, not displace or substitute. I think what we heard, and for those who have been in international education, there really is no digital substitute for traveling to a country and living in it for a year, many years, whether that's post-grad or undergrad. That we'll see we saw on the previous slide, there is 1 billion people around the world who are seeking a post-secondary credential. I've no doubt a very significant number of those will be gained purely online in a domestic circumstance. For sure, some internationally. I mean, we already see in online education so many programs being offered by institutions that international students. I mean, it's even a funny thing to talk about international education online. You think about, I think Coursera has 100 million registered users and most of them are in India. Is that international education? And so for sure, we're having that conversation in digital, but as it relates to students who are making a physical commitment, and in the fine print here, we talked about whether or not to include, for example, you had to fly to do a short residential component of your program overseas, and whether that executive style education counted. And here it does get fuzzy because, as you pointed out, Rajika, there is a shift from undergrad to postgrad in many markets as well. And postgrads are more flexible, adult learners, there are some very different dynamics at play there. So fascinating to see that. I think we're going to jump into another poll here. We've shared a lot of base level assumption, and before revealing how our own global higher education network, and so many of you here are from that network, thought about these questions, we'd love to kind of kick that off by getting a bit of a pulse while we're here now. But, off the back of the last 10 or 15 minutes, how do you expect international education enrollments to grow over the next 5 to 10 years? Share your take and we will jump straight in. We've got jump down to the polls tab down the bottom. You'll see the poll live. Lots of people jumping in now. It's jumping around a bit, so I'm actually a bit nervous to even share what it's saying right now. Really different responses. So, all right, we're getting to a decent sample size now. Slower growth and short bursts above norms are close, but slower growth is actually staying out in front just. Yep, it's staying out in front. Slower growth is number one, about a quarter. Just behind, okay, it's changed again. Neck and neck is revert to long-term average and short bursts above norms. But now stronger growth is equal. Okay, it's really line ball call now. We've got slower growth is out in front by 2%, sitting at 24% of all of you. But then 22%, exactly the same for revert to long-term average, short bursts above norms, and stronger growth, which has a bit of a positive push to it. And then 10% see the market as remaining depressed, and that being the new normal. Okay, slower growth is, we're going to have to see where this settles, but that's really interesting. So just ahead is slower growth, but otherwise there's a positive push. And then now we've only got 9% of people who think it will remain depressed, the new normal. So if I was to map this to our scenarios, actually I won't do that. I think we've got that poll coming up later. All right, fascinating. So what did our own work reveal? When we conducted this survey in April 2021 with our Global Higher Education Network, you can see a much, much higher response of slower growth. So in April last year, 48% of respondents said slower growth. Today, 25% on the poll that we just responded said slower growth. We've seen back in April, we saw, that a large stack there that was still quite optimistic. In January this year, we ran this poll in preparation for this work. You can see it was a very different outlook. So 29% said stronger growth. We had 20% respond just now. Short bursts above norms was 35%. We had 24% people respond that way today. Revert to long-term average was 26% in our January sample, and revert to long today is 22%. 6% of people in January said remain depressed, new normal, and today 9% of people. But slower growth is the biggest discrepancy from today and our January. We have, it's the largest category actually today, back up to 25%. I think just from what I've seen, Rajika, and I'd love to get your take again, is, we obviously have seen the UK really celebrate early on in the year some kind of wonderful numbers and talk about changing the targets for 2030 and being really ambitious. I've seen press in Australia, just as the borders have really started to open up, we've seen, a really positive flow of international students into Australia right now as well. But how are you interpreting all this different kind of take on sentiment? And what did you hear the last few days at AIEA as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I will say that when we talk about the sector, we must also consider the people who work in the sector who actually move this work forward. And I think there was a wonderful positive sentiment at the AIEA conference. I think people were really happy to be back at work, be connecting with each other, moving the work forward, albeit in different ways. So I think that from the perspective of who does the work in the sector, there's really been a sense of being re-energized, and ultimately that serves students better, because I think the sector is bouncing back in many ways. So that's one thing I wanted to note. It's a little hard to say from the conference or even otherwise what sort of that overarching sentiment is, whether there'll be growth or sort of where it might fall along this rubric. But I'll just share sort of what were some dominant themes that I'm sort of seeing emerging and what were some conversations. So one of the big pieces of conversation was really around, regardless of sort of what acronym or what description we use, but the idea of diversity and inclusion and access, which of course has been a growing conversation in international education globally over the past few years. And I think that conversation's just become stronger on, it's not just about moving bodies and moving students, but really taking a hard look at who really has access and how can we be more inclusive in international education practices. And even with the pandemic, on the one hand, it could be argued that it's increased access in some ways because someone doesn't necessarily need to travel to gain some international exposure, although I think the point you made earlier is a good one about what really constitutes actual global learning. So I think that's a good point. But even so, if it's intentional, one could argue that technology opens up that exposure. But at the same time, there's a real digital divide. So we can't assume that online learning and virtual learning will be easily accessible. So I think that's sort of a big piece of the conversation. And then the second theme that I'm hearing more about is something actually that Lucy mentioned right at the beginning when she was walking us through that framework. And Lucy, you mentioned the learner experience. And I think there's a real refocusing back on that perhaps that's gotten lost somewhere. And not just the learner experience in terms of in the learning setting, but also from the perspective of an international student, what does that full arc of the experience look like, right from recruitment to arriving on a campus to what happens afterwards and career opportunities for international students, which are often not handled that well because very often universities don't know what to do with international students because the normal career guidance that they would provide to their domestic students doesn't necessarily apply to international students. So I'll stop there, but I think those are some themes that are really percolating right now in some of the conversations happening here.
It's wonderful. All right, we're going to zip through some more data. Again, this is all available at holoniq.com and you'll receive the recording afterwards as well. But I'll briefly touch on kind of economic impact and the dollar side of the equation. So as we look out from a volume perspective, a price perspective, the mix of postgrad and undergrad, the mix of the change of price in different markets as well. Our outlook saw international education total student expenditure move from 196 billion in 2019. So we picked a pre-pandemic number because it was just a little bit cleaner and easier to put our finger on than it was something in the middle, out to 433 billion in 2030. We've noted the CAGR there of 7.4%. To try and put that in context, you'll recall the long-term volume average was about 5% in the prior 15, 30 years in international education. There's always been very strong price growth in definitely the kind of large destination markets as well. And so we don't consider 7.4% actually a very aggressive forecast, subject to what your view is on how the total volume of student flows will move over time. I'm not going to pause here for too long other than to say you can see we've broken out tuition from some of the other direct expenditure categories. These are enormous industries in themselves. The student accommodation industry, pre-pandemic, around $20 billion was invested each year, and that was a very heavily accelerating market. It's obviously anticipating, it's very anxious about what the future global flows will be as well, because there was a lot of capacity that was being built and some uncertainty as to what future capacity might be as well. We've not included in these numbers, a lot of governments around the world will report really big numbers with indirect expenditure and further flow on, like families flying in and other kind of labor market impacts. we've stuck really core to that expenditure. When you break that out, what is a little bit counterintuitive again is noting the difference of tuition levels in what we've called the Big Four markets that make up nearly half of the total student destination volumes, that being Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US, where tuition relative to the rest of the world is very high. And in the rest of the world, there is a mix of advanced economies that France and Germany are great examples, where there are some, much lower cost, many free, degree programs. And of course, when we're talking about Asia building capacity, the price of the tuition is relatively very, very low compared to tuition that is charged in some of the advanced economies around the world. So that makes up for a really different split of expenditure for students and for those economies as well. What is the average? It varies so much. The average is probably a dangerous number to talk about, other than we've noted here that an international student could spend anywhere from $10,000 up to $100,000 a year across all of these categories. Can be less, can be more as well. It's very broad ranging. And then finally, when we stack all of that up, you think about those Big Four markets accounting for nearly half of the volume, and those Big Four markets being on a relative basis much more expensive from a US dollar basis for tuition. Those Big Four markets, when we add up all of the global tuition, make up a very significant amount of total global tuition in international students. And that is a consequence of those two compounding effects. Half of the global flows, much more expensive tuition. When you multiply those out together, they really take the lion's share of tuition. And you can see that's changing somewhat in the forecast out to 2030 as we see more students studying in Asia, just from a volume perspective as well. And so to close out this part of the webinar, and we're nearly done. Thank you for sticking with us. I just wanted to pause here because we're about to ask you a question on the scenarios. We've shared a lot of information. Rajika, you've shared some just really, really wonderful context, and really double clicked into the primary areas. But for all of you, armed with all of that information and obviously your own insights, there's been some great comments here about these questions applying locally or globally, and you would have responded very differently based off the context. This question we're about to look at is definitely a global perspective. I'm about to ask you which of these three scenarios you think is the most likely or the most probable to play out to 2030. So not giving you any wiggle room to pick a number in the middle. We're asking you to pick one of these scenarios. Which of these scenarios is the most likely growth outlook for enrollments in international education? You have to pick one. If we can send that poll live, and I think we've got it. Okay, wow. Just these polls are surprising me. This is wonderful. So 50% of us at the moment think the upside scenario is the most probable. 53%, it's climbing. Base case, just under 40%. 10% think the downside. If I was to kind of try and connect the last poll, which dominated in slower growth, with this poll, I'd be making up a narrative which went something like, it's going to take a little bit longer to recover than we all think in the short term, but we're underestimating how much it's going to keep growing out to 2030. Rajika, your reflections on this feedback?
It's very difficult to say, really difficult to say. So I'm actually not. I voted. I'm not going to say how I voted, but I think it's hard to know. Yeah.
For sure. Look, and I think you said it really well. I took note actually. projections and forecasts are fraught with all of the assumptions that go into them. But, every decision that we make is based on implicitly our outlook of where things are going to head. We're all making big investments in people, in technology, and processes, and we have to form a view on how we think the enrollments will play out. So I think we're going to leave it there, Lucy, to wrap up. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Rajika.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you both. And I'll wrap up super quickly. Just a reminder that you can use this digital capability framework. Is completely open source, so please use it, reuse it, however you need it for conversations. You are absolutely welcome to do so, and we encourage you to tell us about those conversations that you're having, so we can all keep learning from and through it. If you like going vertically down into the detail, the global case study series that we were sharing a little bit on last year is a great way to do that. That goes deeply into single institutions and works through some of these questions in more detail. We've now collated those in a single post, which is one of my favorites, so I'll try not to linger on this. Just a reminder, if you're not already part of the Global Higher Education Network, you are absolutely welcome to join us. It makes sure that you don't miss future webinars and notes like those case studies as they come out. And then if, like Rajika, you're also making your way back to in-person conferences, a quick reminder, Maria next month is in London for the Times Higher Ed Digital Universities Week. In May, Patrick is over the other side of the Atlantic in Boston for Digital Universities Week, and then coming up very, very quickly in San Diego, the massive ASU GSV Summit, where there's a bunch of HolonIQ people who you can meet if you are around that way. Summits, oh my goodness, we will talk a lot. Please come back to future events. We're out of time, and I don't want to do it disservice, but the HolonIQ Summits are back. They're between 22nd of September and November. So we are coming to you in person, and we can't wait to see you there. It's going to be super exciting. Thank you, Tanya, for putting those notes in there. And next week, we're not having a 2-week break. We are back already next week with the future of OPMs and the partnership market. So we can't wait to see you there. Thank you so much for being part of this. It's been a pleasure. Thank you again, Rajika. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
And we'll see you again soon.
Thanks all.
Thank you.